I sat down across from Margaret Hayes and said, "Lily told me you wanted to talk about our future." She smiled politely and replied, "I do appreciate punctual men, Ethan." I nodded. "I try." She placed a brown envelope on the table and said, "Please don't open this slowly. I dislike drama." I laughed nervously. "I'm not sure what this is." She leaned back and said, "It's a solution." I opened it and froze. "This is money." $10,000, she said calmly. I asked, "Why are you giving me this?" She replied, "I'm helping you leave with dignity." I felt heat in my chest and asked, "Leave what?" She said, "My daughter's life." I swallowed. "Margaret, Lily and I love each other." She shook her head. "Love doesn't pay bills." I forced a smile. "I work hard." She answered, "Hard is not the same as successful." I asked, "Did Lily know about this?" She paused and said, "She trusts my judgment." That pause hurt more than the words. I said, "So you think I'm not good enough?" She replied, "I think you're temporary." My hands shook as I closed the envelope. I said, "You don't know me." She smiled. "I know your income." I laughed softly. "That's not everything." She leaned forward. "It is to us." I thought of Grace then, my sister's voice saying, "Never argue with people who already priced you." I stood up and said, "I won't take this." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Everyone has a price." I looked at the envelope and said, "Not today." She slid it closer. "Think carefully." I replied, "You already have." I walked out before my anger spoke for me. Outside I called Lily. Rang. I said into voicemail, "Your mother met me today." I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. No call back. I whispered, "So this is silence." I walked home hearing Grace again reminding me how people judge without seeing scars. That night Lily finally texted, "We'll talk later." I stared at my phone and replied, "Okay." I placed the envelope on my table and sat across from it, alone. I realized then this wasn't rejection. It was a test. And somewhere Lily was choosing how much I was worth. Lily met me outside my apartment and said, "My mom told me you met today." I replied, "She did more than talk." She frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" I said, "She gave me money." Lily froze and whispered, "Money?" $10,000, I said. She grabbed my hands and said, "Ethan, I swear I didn't know." I searched her face and asked, "You didn't?" She shook her head quickly. "No." She crossed a line. I said, "She told me I wasn't marriage material." Lily sighed and said, "She's old-fashioned." I asked, "Did you tell her anything about us?" She smiled softly. "Only that I love you." I said, "Then why didn't she ask me to stay?" Lily squeezed my fingers. "I'll handle it." I nodded but asked, "How?" She replied, "I'll talk to her." I waited then asked, "Do you want the envelope back?" She blinked. "The envelope?" "The money," I said. She hesitated and said, "Just keep it for now." That pause tightened my chest. I asked, "Why?" She laughed lightly. "Ethan, don't make this weird." I said, "It already is." She leaned in and whispered, "We'll be fine." I wanted to believe her. I asked, "Do you see a future with me?" She said, "Of course I do." I asked, "What kind of future?" She smiled. "A stable one." I said, "That sounds careful." She joked, "Careful is good." Later, when I mentioned my job, she asked, "Any raises coming?" I shrugged. "Why?" She laughed. "I'm just curious." When I asked about her spending, she said, "Don't worry about it." Her words were soft, but they closed doors. That night Daniel called me. He said, "You sound quiet." I replied, "Something feels off." He asked, "Did she defend you?" I said, "She avoided choosing." Daniel said, "That is choosing." I argued, "You don't know her." He answered, "I know patterns." After the call, Lily texted, "Did you talk to Daniel again?" I replied, "Yes." She sent, "He doesn't like me." I typed, "He's worried about me." She replied, "You worry too much." I stared at that message for a long time. When she came over, she kissed me and said, "Don't overthink us." I asked, "Do you believe in us?" She said, "I believe in progress." That word stayed with me. Not love. Not commitment. Progress. As she fell asleep beside me, I realized she wasn't trapped between her family and me. She was measuring which side offered more. I never told Lily how much I really earned, and she never asked in a way that felt honest. One night she laughed and said, "I just want a comfortable future." I smiled and replied, Comfort means different things to different people. She said, it usually means security. I asked, emotional or financial? She hesitated and said, both, obviously. That hesitation stayed with me. I remembered Grace telling me, hide your light until you know who loves you in the dark. Victor Lang had said something similar years ago. He told me, money reveals people faster than truth ever can. So I stayed quiet. When Lily asked, why don't you talk about work much? I said, I like keeping life simple. She laughed. You're mysterious. I replied, or boring. She shook her head. No, just careful. I decided to test that care. At dinner I didn't reach for the check. She looked at it and joked, you're changing? I asked, is that bad? She said, just unexpected. I said nothing. On another day she said, my friend's boyfriend just bought her a car. I replied, that's generous. She asked, would you ever do that? I said, if it felt right. She smiled but her eyes searched my face. Days passed. I stopped offering. I stopped fixing problems she didn't ask about. She grew quieter. One night she said, you've been distant. I asked, from you or from spending? She frowned. Why say it like that? I answered, because I'm trying to understand. She said, understand what? I replied, what you expect. She crossed her arms. I expect effort. I asked, in what form? She sighed. You're overthinking. I wasn't. I was watching. Daniel noticed before I said anything. He asked, why do you look like you're waiting for something to break? I said, because it usually does. He replied, trust your instincts. I told Lily less. She asked fewer questions. That silence grew heavy. One evening she said, you don't talk about the future anymore. I answered, I'm listening instead. She didn't like that. She said, it feels like you're pulling away. I replied, I'm standing still. She looked at me and said, that's not how relationships work. I asked, how do they work? She said, you build together. I nodded. But she had already stopped building with me. Love didn't disappear. Interest did. Lily texted me, dinner tonight? My family wants peace. I replied, I'll come. When I arrived, Margaret smiled and said, I'm glad you accepted. I answered, so am I. We sat down and Lily squeezed my hand under the table. She whispered, let's start fresh. Margaret said, family dinners are about honesty. I nodded. I agree. Her brother spoke about profits and said, connections matter more than effort. I said, effort still matters. Margaret smiled too hard and replied, not in our world. Lily laughed quickly and said, you're both right. I watched her eyes avoid mine. Margaret asked, Ethan, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I answered, building something meaningful. She said, meaningful doesn't guarantee security. I replied, neither does money. The table went quiet. Lily cleared her throat and said, that's actually why we're here. I looked at her and asked, why? She took a breath and said, I think we need space. I asked, space from what? She said, from expectations. Margaret added, from mismatched paths. I said, is this what you want, Lily? She hesitated and replied, I think it's best. I nodded slowly and said, for who? She didn't answer. Margaret placed the same brown envelope on the table. She said, no hard feelings. I stared at it and said, you planned this. Lily whispered, please don't make it worse. I replied, you already decided. Margaret said, be reasonable. I looked at Lily and asked, was I ever enough? She said quietly, you're kind? That hurt more than anger. I asked, is kindness a flaw now? Margaret replied, it's a weakness. I said, then I'll keep it. Lily reached for me and said, Ethan, don't. I pulled my hand back and asked, when did you stop choosing me? She whispered, I never learned how. Margaret sighed and said, this is getting emotional. I laughed softly and said, that's the problem. Her brother stood and said, let's end this politely. I replied, you ended it before I arrived. I pushed the chair back and said, keep your money? Margaret replied, pride is expensive. I answered, so is regret. Lily said, I didn't want it like this. I looked at her and said, but you allowed it. She started to cry and said, I was scared. I nodded and replied, so was I. I walked out without looking back. Outside, I realized they weren't ending something. They were confirming a decision already made. I wasn't losing Lily at that table. I had already lost her somewhere else. I found out on my phone during lunch and muttered, "So this is how." Clara looked up and asked, "How what?" I locked the screen and said, "Nothing important." She frowned. "You've been quiet all week." I replied, "Some people leave quietly." She said, "That usually means it mattered." I didn't answer. Later, I opened the post again and whispered, "Oliver Hayes." The photo showed Lily smiling beside him. I said to myself, "So this is the upgrade." Daniel called me that night and asked, "You saw it, didn't you?" I replied, "Everyone saw it." He said, "How do you feel?" I laughed once. "Educated." Daniel sighed. "Don't do anything stupid." I said, "I'm not angry." He replied, "That's when you're dangerous." I closed the app and told myself, "Watch, don't react." The next day Margaret posted congratulations. I whispered, approval came fast. At work, Clara sat beside me and said, "You didn't finish your coffee." I replied, "Didn't need it." She asked, "Is it Lily?" I said, "She made a choice." Clara nodded. "That hurts." I answered, "It clarifies." That evening, Daniel met me for a drink and said, "Revenge isn't noise." I replied, "I know." He said, "Then do nothing." I smiled. "I plan to." My phone buzzed. Lily texted, "I hope you understand." I stared at it and whispered, "I do." Daniel asked, "What did she say?" I showed him the screen. He scoffed. "That's not an apology." I replied, "It's a conclusion." At home, I scrolled through comments praising Oliver's success. I said aloud, "Rich on paper." Grace's voice echoed in my head, "People fall in love with reflections." I remembered Lily asking once, "Where do you see yourself in 10 years?" I had said, "Peaceful." She laughed and replied, "That's not ambitious." Now I understood that moment. The next morning Clara asked, "Are you okay?" I answered, "Better than before." She studied me and said, "You sound different." I replied, "I stopped pretending." That afternoon Daniel texted, "Still calm?" I answered, "Still learning." That night I deleted Lily's number. I said quietly, "Lesson received." She didn't leave because she found someone better. She left because she measured me and decided I was a risk. I sat alone and said, "You chose certainty over truth." The pain was sharp but clean. I didn't lose her. I lost the version of myself that believed love was blind. That I stopped reacting to Lily's posts, and Daniel noticed first. He said, "You've gone quiet." I replied, "Quiet builds things." He laughed. "That sounds dangerous." I said, "Only to people who talk too much." Victor called me the same week and said, "I want you to meet someone." I asked, "A client?" He replied, "A shield." I met Nathan Brooks in a small office. Nathan shook my hand and said, "You don't look reckless." I smiled. "I learned the hard way." He asked, "Assets hidden?" I said, "Protected." He nodded. "Then we'll keep it that way." While Lily posted dinners and vacations, I signed papers and asked questions. Victor said, "Use your real name now." I asked, "You think it's time?" He answered, "You're tired of pretending." I said, "I'm tired of being judged by shadows." At work, Clara watched me closely. She asked, "Are you okay?" I replied, "I'm stable." She frowned. "That's not the same thing." I said, "It's better than broken." She leaned on my desk and said, "You don't talk about her anymore." I answered, "She talks enough for both of us." Clara smiled sadly. "You sound stronger." I shook my head. "Clearer." One night, Lily's name appeared on my phone. Her message read, "I'm engaged." I stared at it. Then another message followed. "I hope you can come." I typed, "When?" She replied, "Saturday." It would mean a lot. I paused, then sent, "I'll be there." Daniel called immediately. He said, "Why would you do that?" I answered, "Because silence isn't hiding." He sighed. "You're playing a long game." I said, "I'm done playing." Victor texted me later. "You're ready?" I replied, "Ready for what?" He wrote, "To be seen." The night before the party, I sat alone and remembered Grace. I said out loud, "I didn't chase revenge." Her voice echoed in my head, "You chose truth." I smiled. The next morning, Nathan called and said, "Everything is secure." I asked, "Nothing traces back quietly?" He replied, "Only confidence." Lily sent one last message. She wrote, "I'm glad we can be mature." I answered, "So am I." I dressed simply for the party. I told myself, I'm not going to confront anyone. I repeated, I'm not going to explain. I looked at my reflection and said, just watch. As I left my apartment, Daniel texted, good luck. I replied, luck is for people without preparation. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies. I wanted the truth to walk into the room before I did. I stepped into the hall and someone whispered, that's him. Margaret's glass paused midair. Lily's smile froze, then cracked. Oliver frowned and asked, who is that? Victor spotted me and said loudly, Ethan, you're finally here. I replied, I wouldn't miss this. He smiled and added, everyone, this is Ethan Cole, founder and majority owner of Cole Maritime. The room shifted. Margaret said sharply, Victor, now isn't the time. Victor answered, I disagree. Lily walked toward me and whispered, why are you here? I said, you invited me. She forced a laugh. I didn't think you'd come. I wanted to congratulate you, I said. Oliver offered his hand. Oliver Hayes. I shook it. Ethan. Oliver asked, so what do you do? Before I spoke, someone behind him said, he owns the shipping firm we tried to partner with. Oliver blinked. You never told me that. I smiled. You never asked. Margaret stepped closer and said, Ethan prefers privacy. I nodded. I do. A woman nearby asked, how long have you known Lily? I answered, long enough to know silence can be loud. Lily whispered, please don't do this. I replied softly, I'm not doing anything. Victor raised his glass. To honesty. Some people laughed nervously. Others stared at Lily. Oliver asked her, what's he talking about? She said quickly, nothing. I added, I wish you both happiness. Margaret said through her teeth, you've made your point. I asked, what point is that? She didn't answer. Someone else asked me, are you investing locally now? I said, I already am. Whispers followed. Lily's hands trembled. She pulled me aside and said, did you plan this? I looked at her. I planned my life. She said, you're embarrassing me. I replied, you embarrassed yourself. Oliver stepped closer. Is there something I should know? Lily said, no. I said, yes. Margaret snapped, Ethan. I raised my hand. Relax. I won't say it. Oliver stared at Lily. She avoided his eyes. Victor leaned toward me and said, you handled that well. I replied, I'm just standing here. The music resumed, but conversations didn't. People watched Lily instead of me. She whispered, I didn't know you were like this. I answered, you never wanted to. Margaret walked away. Oliver followed her. Lily stayed behind and said, I was protecting my future. I said, so was I. She asked, do you hate me? I shook my head. I see you. Her eyes filled not with love but fear. I left the hall as whispers grew louder behind me that I heard the rumors before I got the call. Daniel said, Oliver's investors are pulling out. I replied, that's business. He paused. Lily's name is being mentioned. I said nothing. That evening my phone rang. Margaret said, Ethan, I hope you're well. I answered, I am. She continued, I heard you're expanding overseas. I replied, news travels fast. She laughed lightly. I was wondering if you had heard about Oliver. I said, I don't follow his life. She sighed. Things are unstable. I asked, why are you calling me? She said, I thought you might offer advice. I smiled to myself. I'm not qualified. Her voice tightened. You're being modest. I answered, I'm being honest. She went quiet, then said, Lily misses you. I replied, missing isn't the same as choosing. She hung up without goodbye. The next day Lily texted me. She wrote, can we talk? Just us. I answered, where? She replied, the park near your place. When I arrived she was already there. She said, you look different. I asked, better or worse? She hesitated. Stronger. I nodded. You didn't come to comment on my posture. She looked down and said, things are falling apart. I replied, they usually do when built on pressure. She said, did you do something? I asked, do what? She said, with Oliver's company. I shook my head. No. She studied my face. You're telling the truth. I answered, karma doesn't need assistance. She laughed weakly. You always said things like that. I said, you used to listen. She swallowed. I made a mistake. I asked, which one? She said, choosing safety over you. I replied, you didn't choose safety. You chose control. Her eyes filled. I was scared. I said, so was I. I just didn't sell anyone to feel better. She stepped closer. Do you hate me? I thought for a moment. No. She whispered, then why does this hurt so much? I answered, because regret hurts more than rejection. She cried quietly and said, I wish I could go back. I replied, I don't. She looked up sharply. Why? I said, because I finally see clearly. She reached for my hand then stopped. She asked, is there still a chance? I shook my head. You're asking now because you're losing control. She broke down and said, I don't know who I am anymore. I stood up and said, neither did I until you left. As I walked away, I heard her sob. I didn't turn around. Not because I was cruel. But because her tears were for power slipping away, not love returning. The phone rang and the caller ID said Margaret Hayes. I hesitated before answering. Ethan, she said, her voice syrupy. Can we talk? I'm listening, I replied cautiously. There's a way to fix this, she said. I can make it worth your while, substantially. I raised an eyebrow. Substantially? Yes. I can offer you enough money that it would make the first envelope look like pocket change. I laughed bitterly. So you think money can fix everything? She paused. It can fix what you've lost. I said, I don't want anything from you. I want honesty, which you've never offered. Margaret's tone hardened. You're letting pride blind you. I could solve everything. I replied evenly, you already lost me. No amount can change that. The line went quiet. Then Lily spoke, her voice shaky. Ethan, please. I made a mistake. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. A mistake. I repeated. Do you even understand what that means? I chose wrong, she said, tears audible in her voice. I didn't realize. I cut her off. If I were still broke, would you even be here? Her silence was deafening. I continued, my voice steady. You don't get to rewrite what you chose. You can beg, you can cry, you can promise, but I've already seen the truth. I love you, she whispered. I shook my head. Love doesn't undo choices. It doesn't erase the past. Margaret interjected. Ethan, please think about the money, think about fixing everything for Lily. I interrupted her firmly. No. Your money never mattered. It's not about money. It's about respect, trust, and honesty. You never had those for me. Lily's voice cracked. I just wanted to make it right. I smiled faintly, sad and detached. Making it right doesn't mean you get a second chance at me. Closure isn't bought. It's earned by truth. A long pause followed. Neither of them spoke. Finally I said, goodbye, Lily. And you, Margaret, remember, some things money can't reach. I hung up. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a strange relief. That silence, that absence of a response from Lily, was my closure. No envelope, no apology, no promise could change what I'd already learned. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. For the first time, I realized the weight I had been carrying wasn't hers, it was mine. And letting it go didn't need her permission. I placed my phone down, closed my eyes, and exhaled slowly. The past was gone, the future mine to shape. I had my closure. I didn't need anything else. That I saw the news first on my phone. Oliver had left Lily. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Clara noticed my silence. Ethan, are you okay? She asked gently. I'm fine, I said, not meeting her eyes. She tilted her head. You don't seem fine. I shrugged. It's complicated. Want to talk about it? She offered. I shook my head. There's nothing to say. Actions speak louder than words. Later, I ran into Margaret at a business event. She smiled, but I could see the strain in her eyes. Ethan, I hope you're well, she said, voice too smooth. I am, I replied calmly. Life moves on. Her smile faltered. You don't hold grudges? I learned long ago that grudges weigh more on the holder, I said. Whispers started around the room. Margaret's reputation, carefully built, carefully polished, was cracking quietly. I didn't intervene. I just existed, quietly honest. Clara joined me at the balcony. It's strange, isn't it? She said. Watching it all unfold and not feeling the urge to fight back? I nodded. I realized revenge is empty. Let the truth do the work. She smiled softly. And it's working. I looked out over the city lights. The skyline had never looked calmer. I feel free, but not happy. Not yet. Just free. Freedom is the start, she said. Peace comes next. I let her words sink in. For years I had carried anger like armor. Now it was shedding. Slowly, almost painfully. Clara, I said, thank you for not asking me to promise anything. Just being honest with me. She placed her hand lightly on mine. You deserve someone who sees the truth, Ethan. Not illusions. I smiled faintly, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. I think I finally understand that. I turned back to the balcony railing, breathing in the cool night air. No envelopes, no manipulations, no false apologies. Just the quiet truth. And for the first time it was enough. I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. But the emptiness was clean, like a page waiting to be written. And maybe that was enough. For the first time in years I allowed myself to hope. The masks had fallen. The world was bare. And I was still standing. The letter arrived in the morning, neatly folded with Lily's handwriting. I stared at it for a moment, tracing the curves of her name. I opened it slowly. Ethan, I don't know where to begin, it read. I've thought about us every day. I made mistakes. I hurt you. I wanted the life I thought I deserved, and I didn't see what I had. I sighed. I whispered, I hear you. The letter continued, pouring regrets, apologies, and confessions. Every word reminded me of her charm and cunning. I set it down. You think words fix what you broke? I muttered. I read it again, this time slower, letting each sentence sink. I forgive you, Lily, I whispered, the words soft but firm. Clara peeked into my study. Everything okay? I held the letter. I forgive her, but it doesn't mean she gets to come back. She nodded. Good. Forgiveness is for you, not for her. I smiled faintly. Grace always said I deserved more than conditional love. I think I'm starting to understand that. I picked up a lighter. The letter trembled in my hand. This ends here, I said. The flames caught quickly. The smell of burning paper filled the room, and I watched every word disintegrate into ash. I felt something lift, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Clara said softly, it's like a part of you was waiting for this. I nodded. I can't go back. I won't go back. Forgiveness doesn't mean access. It means freedom. I let the ash fall into the sink, watching the last piece of Lily's letter disappear. I hope she understands, I murmured, though I knew she didn't need to. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. How's your peace? I typed back slowly, it's real now. No anger. Just me. Clara leaned against the doorframe. Then maybe it's time to start living for yourself. I nodded, staring out the window. The city was quiet, the sky softening with dawn. I felt empty, but it was a clean emptiness, one I could fill with something real. The past was burned. The manipulations, the letters, the regrets, they were all gone. I whispered Grace's words again, letting them echo. You deserve more than conditional love. And this time I believed it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something rarer, calm. I forgave her in my heart, but I didn't return. I would never return. I stepped out of the cafe and felt the cool wind hit my face. The envelope, the $10,000, and Margaret Hayes' smug smile felt like a lifetime ago. Daniel called. So, how does it feel to walk away? I smiled faintly. Different. Lighter, somehow. You don't look bitter, he said. I'm not, I replied. I'm clear. I've survived worse than this. Clara joined me for lunch later. You seem peaceful, she said. I am, I said, stirring my coffee. Not victorious. Not triumphant. Just aware. I chose myself. She tilted her head. That's rare. People always think winning is about others losing, I said. But winning is about standing in your own truth. I remembered Lily's messages, her apologies, her mother's envelopes. They tried to buy me, scare me, manipulate me, but I wasn't for sale. Daniel laughed over the phone. You really did take the high road. I leaned back. Not high. Just honest. That's the only path that mattered. Clara smiled. And it feels good? It feels like breathing, I said. Like shedding years of weight I didn't realize I carried. I thought about Grace, her quiet voice in my memory. You deserve more than conditional love. I whispered it aloud. I finally understand that. Clara reached across the table. And you'll never settle for less again? Never, I said firmly. No one else's opinion, no one else's money, and certainly no one else's lies will make me compromise who I am. I glanced around. Life moved on around me, people, traffic, chatter, but I felt untouched. Free from the chaos they had tried to drag me into. You walked away with more than money, Clara said softly. You walked away with clarity. I nodded. $10,000? That was nothing compared to what I gained, my own life. Daniel chimed in again. So what now? I smiled faintly, looking at the horizon. Now I build my life on my terms. Not for approval, not for love, not for money. Just for me. Clara smiled. That sounds real. It is, I said. And that's enough. I stood, feeling the weight lift completely. The past, the manipulations, the broken promises, they were all behind me. I wasn't running from them. I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply walking forward. And for the first time I felt whole. I didn't win because they lost. I won because I chose myself.